Okay, this is the second to last day, technically, that I will be broadcasting. And I'm doing a little bit up to the 70s. And my big goal here was to get into some of the events that relate directly to here. I did not get as far as I wanted to necessarily, but that's the way it goes. And same deal, my last assignment that will be due will be to turn in these notes. Also, I did give you 2 more opportunities for extra credit. There's a movie, so go World War II movie, I have a list, there's an assignment. And I also said that if you go to my World War II section of my AP US History notes, World War II, and go down to Banzai and On Our Way. Because I suggested that before, then I decided to move on past it, but since I put it out there, if anybody does the worksheet for that, I wonder if the old Daily Motion thing went dead. Well, the MP4, that should work. If it doesn't, let me know. I had it, World at War. There's some copyright issues because it's the most popular documentary of all time, and so might be some issues. But I gave you 2 additional examples of extra credit. There was a quiz on the 60s. For some reason, the short ID, it only put it down for 2 points, even though I put down 20. So it should have been out of 56, not 38. So some of you might be thinking, yeah, I got a huge extra credit. Sorry, but still. And I'll get that in the grade book. It's not syncing at all. And so I got to wait till I get everyone done before I type them all in. And so I'm still waiting for a couple from last week, but I think I'm going to probably do that this afternoon. At least get some of those in. But for sure by tomorrow. And here's the deal. I'm going to give you then, basically, I'm assigning nothing new this week and next week. And so if you have any makeup work, go ahead and get it done. Go back and look. If you did something and it's not graded, please let me know. But here's the deal. It is hard to go back and look and see if somebody turned in an assignment. It takes a long time. And so it's easy to miss things because it's just not laid out very good to look at that. So if you turn something in, you have to let me know. And then I'll go back and look. If you don't let me know, there's a very good chance I won't see it. So please take a look at that. Also, get this squared away. Okay. Also, there's a few of you that are taking the makeup AP exam. And I've set out things individually to you, but just to remind you that if you have any questions, please talk to me, go through how to write a DBQ, make sure you relate the document to facts, all of that. It's tomorrow, so get the time, get everything all squared away. Make sure you get your ticket, e-ticket or whatever it's called, all that kind of stuff. For those of you who already taken it, good for you. All right. So let's go ahead then and finish up Nixon. And I talked about My Lai, this horrible massacre, and how this became such a cultural indicator and really part of the conservative revival. And you'll see this time after time will come throughout history then, how this will become a symbol of what side you're on. And it's amazing how so many of these things tie together. From racism to sexism to pro-war, anti-war, hawks and doves, etc. And also talked about the growth of the women's rights movement and the feminine mystique, the great book by Betty Friedan. And the mystique was that that women somehow could be happy with just a purely domestic role. And Betty Friedan wrote in the feminine mystique, that's simply not true. Just as men could not be happy with only one potential for success. But of course, part of the conservative revival will be to attack feminists as saying they want to destroy the families. And I told you about the ERA and how it said that they wanted to be, this would destroy marriages and force women to become lesbians and abandon their children and all that. That was a way to attack that and get back to traditional values. And now Phyllis Schlafly led the anti-ERA fight. And so many men could say, see, women don't even want equal rights. And also don't forget the importance of birth control, the birth control pill, and abortion rights. And if women do not have access to birth control, that dramatically affects their economic well-being. Will keep women technically as second-class citizens, because if they can't control when they have children, that makes them always dependent upon men. Therefore, by definition, they're second class. So with that, we talked about My Lai and the huge anti-war moratorium. And this is going to lead to Richard Nixon's grand strategy to end the war. And it was to marginalize the anti-war movement. And what he wanted to do is push the idea that those against the war, those opposing the war, were doves. Were hippies and traitors. The doves were just a bunch of drug addicts, and this is a very stylized picture from San Francisco. And this is to many people like their vision of the anti-war protests, which is simply not true. But it's amazing how that's come about. And I'm going to move my mug. Remind me to move. Wrong picture. There's me. Out of the way of Muhammad Ali. I'll come back to that. But the idea is that hippies and traitors, these doves, are actually against the United States. They oppose the United States and therefore aiding the enemy, therefore traitors. And more they're going to bring up the ideology. Hawkswood, the pro-war people, and this is pure Richard Nixon, would bring up the idea that they have stabbed us in the back. If not for the anti-war movement and the media that reported the war, the United States would have won that war. If not for the anti-war movement. And this should remind you of something. The stab in the back directly comes from what happened after World War I in Germany, where many people, mostly very right-wing, I talked about that, very nationalistic people in Germany, said that Germany would have won the war if not for these anti-war people, especially the socialists, especially the communists. And so that was a big issue, and people still say that today. I can't believe how many people have told me that if we only let the generals win the war. Well, most people couldn't tell you what the war was, to keep 2 Vietnams. And how many people do you want to kill? The United States is going to end up dropping more bombs on North Vietnam, which technically the U.S. wasn't at war with, technically, in 4 years than all the bombing of both sides in the Pacific Theater of World War II. They would drop more bombs in the South, than by 1972, than all the explosive power used in World War II. Just U.S. bomb dropping. I'm not even talking artillery. I'm not really sure what else they wanted, but let's get back to this. Stab in the back. And it was a 3-pronged and very effective politically. Number 1, to turn the draft to a lottery. The draft, and you see this person burning his draft card in the middle right there. The draft was very unfair, especially at first. Draft boards could arbitrarily pick people, and especially people they didn't like or didn't have political connections. The most famous would be Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was the heavyweight champion of the world, but because he changed his name and was very outspoken against the war, the Memphis Draft Board, sorry, it doesn't have my picture. Okay, we're fine. The Lexington Draft Board, they drafted him, even though he was older than the average soldier, they drafted him just to punish him for his anti-war views. In fact, he would lose his prime years as a boxer and be stripped of his title and went around the country protesting the war and demanding equal rights. Muhammad Ali is a pretty amazing person who used his celebrity to push for a higher goal. And of course, many people would hate him for that, especially since he changed his name and became a Muslim. But it showed how unfair it was. If people with a little bit of money, at least at first, could go to college, they weren't drafted. Get married, weren't drafted. Have children, get drafted. And eventually they would get rid of those, but if you could find a friendly doctor you could get out of the draft. Or find some political connections and go to the National Guard. You didn't have to go to the draft. So you see, a lot of people with a little bit of money would find a doctor who would say they had, some kind of congenital problem. Our current president had bone spurs, and that's how he avoided the draft. And what they did is they changed it to, I have bone spurs, by the way, but they changed it to a lottery. And the lottery is what they did in World War I and World War II, and it was a random number by birthdays. And so they just give every birthday a random number from 1 to 365. And then they would just say, okay, you got a random number, and then they would decide twice a year how many soldiers they needed, and they would arbitrarily pick a number like 100. So everybody below 100 at age 19 at that time, they did it by birthdays. You were drafted. Everybody above that weren't drafted. And that alleviated some of the pressure, because it made it more random, it wasn't as arbitrary, and it also went two other ways. Once you reached 19, you went into the draft pool. If you weren't drafted there, you're basically done that first time. And then the next age group would be drafted. Also, let's say you pull out number 350. You're not going to get drafted, so you're relatively fine. And if you get below that, let's say you get 1. Well, sure, you might be going to war. But the big thing about that was that you knew that you're probably going to get drafted, and gave yourself options. For example, if you volunteered for the military, you got to pick the service. If you were drafted, they pick for you. And what do they need? Infantrymen. Search and destroy missions. I think you're going to understand why they didn't want that. The draft alleviated, to go to a lottery, alleviated pressure. By law right now, technically, if the U.S. would start a draft, it would go back to a lottery. So, next. Sorry. There we go. Vietnamization. Vietnamization was an effort to turn over the war to the South Vietnamese. And it's a two-pronged way. They literally called it Vietnamization. So try to equip and better train the South Vietnamese army. And one of the big things is definitely needed better officers. That was the huge problem. Terrible officers. And it seemed to work, because as they turned more of the combat over to the South Vietnamese, it was just in the wake of the Tet Offensive. And the big thing about the Tet Offensive was, on the battlefield, the Viet Cong lost. And they were decimated, and their numbers never recovered. So there was a couple years where the fighting was still very fierce and casualties were high. But the illusion was the Viet Cong was being subdued. Now, it was purely an illusion. It would blow up later. But it gave the illusion the South Vietnamese army was doing well, and that allowed Nixon to the next step, bring troop numbers down. So he could start pulling out American infantrymen. Now, while that's going on, they started bombing South Vietnam heavier, which led to more casualties, more napalm, more Agent Orange. But at least the number of American soldiers and potential of combat went down. And this graph shows how quickly the numbers went down after Tet. And so it gave the illusion that the United States was ending the war, because, frankly, just like today, most Americans won't really pay as much attention if it's Vietnamese dying, as long as it's not Americans dying. We saw the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And trust me, around the world they'll know. Well, almost forgot one more thing. I thought I put it on there. One more thing they did. Where is it at here? They also bitterly attacked the media. And I thought I left that in there. Everyone write down, Nixon bitterly attacked the media. And what he did is, he did everything from bribing, pleading with media members to threatening tax audits by the IRS. If big media like the 3 television networks and the major newspapers, he begged them to quit reporting the war. Take it off the front page. And for the most part, the media agreed, despite rhetoric from, well, that whole stab in the back thing, that the media was reporting the war as as the media was anti-war by their reporting of the war. The media was basically pro-establishment. And even after Tet, they were pretty for the war, or at least saying we have reporting the story that the administration wanted. So these were effective at first, and then Cambodia hit. In 1969 and 1970, part of Nixon's Vietnamization was to get rid of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to knock it out. They began secret bombing of neutral Cambodia. So they're bombing another neutral country. They're already bombing Laos with B-52 bombers. And they would bomb all the way till 1975. This would lead to a horrific civil war in Cambodia and a genocide. So the United States would be responsible. That's our country right now. And this section right here, this was a big area of infiltration. The Parrot's Beak, they call this region of Cambodia sticks into Vietnam. And you know, it's like almost like points at Saigon, the capital. And so that was the plan. And so they're pulling troops out, but secretly bombing. So very few people knew. It was a big deal when this came out. And then, at the end of April 1970, the United States and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, they invaded Cambodia. Their plan was to knock out Viet Cong and North Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia is neutral. But remember, the U.S. is big. We can do what we want. This will have terrible blowback down the road. But to many Americans, even though we're pulling troops out, this is all of a sudden a huge escalation. A huge escalation. There's Nixon on national TV explaining it. This is the similar map. And this will lead to an explosion. Just as the thought was we're pulling out of the war, now Nixon, who many people believe you could not trust, the man who barely won for president, it blew up. And this is going to trigger massive protests all over the United States. College campuses erupted. In fact, the ROTC building at the University of Montana was burned. A good friend of mine who used to be a teacher for years and retired a few years ago, Mr. Sims. Some of you might have had him for a sub a couple years ago. He subbed a little bit in this time. He was at that protest, and when he was at the anti-war protest at University of Montana. And when the ROTC building caught fire, he decided, time to go home. But this, to many people, became Nixon's war. It became Nixon's war. And even though, Lyndon Johnson, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson started it, he's the one who escalated it. And these protests blew up all over, especially college campuses. The draft is coming back. The lottery numbers are going to change. But a few days after this was announced, at Kent State, just as protests were actually dying down, but the governor of Ohio had sent out the National Guard, and there was this movement by especially Hawks. You got to crack down on these protesters. Law and order, law and order, law and order. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? But crack down on the protests. At Kent State, the protests had basically died. This is Friday, so it's 4 days after Nixon announced this. Literally, classes were starting up again, but very untrained National Guardsmen. Many of them have joined the National Guard to avoid the draft. Totally untrained for this, much like today. They'd surrounded the campus. And just before lunch, when the classes had just started again after being 3 days out, were releasing students. Students began to cross this big field right here, the Commons, that's surrounded by National Guardsmen. Peaceful. This is after the shooting. This picture right here. Somebody in National Guard, they just opened fire. And this will trigger just screaming and yelling. They shot tear gas, and 4 students would be killed. This would be a famous picture of a student dying, or wounded student. This person did not die. He was dead. She didn't know him, just came across him. And over 20 would be wounded at Kent State in Ohio. And just, I should add, this will lead to, you might think a lot of people would be really upset with the National Guard and the administration, and many people were. But there are also just as many people saying the students deserve it and we should kill more. That should give you an idea how bitterly divided the country was. So divided. We should have killed them all. And then at Jackson State, just a few days later, a similar thing happened with an anti-war protest. State police and National Guard surrounded it and opened fire without any warning into students and crowds. Ended up wounding over 150 students. You can see 10 seriously. This is the dormitories hit by this. And Jackson State, though, was not as well known as Kent State because it was an all-black school. And so remember, well, this is the legacy of slavery and racism goes on. But this seemed like this massive protest. But this is why it's so much different. This is Nixon war, this anti-war protest, all over. But the biggest counter-protest happened at the same time. Just 4 days after Kent State, a series of protests began all over the United States, most famously in New York City, the Hardhat riots. And this is an example of the conservative backlash against the anti-war movement. And here the Hardhats as the idea they're construction workers, but working class people, angry. Remember I told you about the Democratic Convention in Chicago. So many people were upset that the Democratic Convention, or that the protesters at the Democratic Convention, so many police officers were upset that these are rich, spoiled kids, while my kids go to war, while I follow the rules, and they get off the draft. Now, of course, it's much more complex than that. But Nixon played on this resentment and he really did consciously work to rile them up. Oh, I got a question. Why did they fire at Jackson State? Well, Kent State, just because they saw people crossing the field and they panicked. At Jackson State, they just rode up, saw protests, and opened fire. Just open fire. If there's and these are state police. State police in Alabama, that's equivalent of National Guard. I should add this whole police violence has, there's violence, there's a lot of violence in a lot of different ways, but the police, that's the state, that's us. And we're violent. And it can be out of control violence. Yeah, Jackson State, there were protests, and they pulled up, told them to disperse, and then open fire. At Kent State, people started walking across the common, literally being got out of class. And these ill-trained National Guardsmen panicked, and somebody fired, and that triggered them all to open fire. And you can see stuff like that right now. Training, people being scared, provocative. Back to this. So the Hardhat riots, what happened is these guys came out, and they're all wearing hard hats, but they came out with clubs and wrenches and just beat the hell out of the anti-war protests. And here it is, impeached the Red Mayor. Mayor Lindsay was a liberal Republican in mayor of New York. And here you impeach the Red Mayor, the commie. And they just went off on him. And the police stood by and watched. And Nixon was overjoyed. Nixon could see the Democratic Party breaking apart. Working class Democrats, working class white Democrats that benefited from the New Deal and Democratic programs. In fact, benefited so much that the two Republican presidents of that era, Eisenhower and Nixon, basically still had to adopt Keynesian economics. But now those white working class Democrats could start to be cleaved away. Not all of them, but just enough to give Republicans a majority, saying what you have now is being taken away by the civil rights movement, being taken away by women demanding rights, being taken away by these anti-war protesters who want to bring everything down. And the backlash would be huge. And that's when Nixon would come out with his saying, the great silent majority. Regular, hard-working people like me and you who are having our rights taken away. And here's Nixon immediately got a hard hat. He put the head of a construction union, pipe fitters union in New York City, as his labor secretary. Even though they disagree totally on economics, it's all cultural indicators. Hard hats versus anti-war protesters. What side are you on? It's kind of like the mask thing today. And here is for the 1972 Democratic Convention with a hard hat. And he's standing up for you, the great silent majority. Now, it didn't work in the 70 midterms, but wow, did it work for the next, well, all the way through, I would say, 9:56 our time. And so, while this is going on, Nixon very cleverly was beginning what they would call détente. Cold War tensions were beginning to drop. And you might think, wait a second, how could Cold War tensions being dropped with anti-war protests and the Vietnam War going? Well, Nixon, the rabid anti-communist, began arms control talks with the Soviet Union. Right here is Leonid Brezhnev. And Nixon began a series of talks with Leonid Brezhnev to limit the number of nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. And they called this SALT, the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation. SALT, strategic arms limitations talks. And they didn't reduce the number, just limited the number. Still more than enough to blow up the world many, 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 many times, but limited the number of bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that sort of thing. And here it is, Nixon and Brezhnev, the idea being, they both have missiles for this talk, and conservative Republicans and some conservative Democrats soon would get the name neoconservatives all the way through to today. They'd be the ones for the Iraq War. They were furious with Nixon by giving in to the Soviets. And this will lead to the massive arms buildup and near destruction of the world under President Reagan. We came within a couple hours in 1983. I'm really glad in 1983 I didn't know that. I just knew it was close. And so conservatives were furious about this. I just like this picture. And also, I know what you're thinking, and you're welcome. Finally, you get to see a picture of Leonid Brezhnev without a shirt. That, you think, you seen Putin, how about Brezhnev? By the way, me growing up, my vision of the Soviet Union were these eyebrows. He was an old Stalinist. Remember, I mentioned him once before. The Soviets began a massive arms buildup after being, as they saw it, humiliated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this would devastate the Soviet economy because all their money would go into weapons and not to things that people needed, like food. And don't forget, military spending is literally like taking a shovel and shoveling money down a well, because it doesn't build anything after you build the tank. Oh, sure, you might hire people to build a tank, etc., and hire, use the raw materials, etc. But then you have a tank or a missile, and the best case scenario is that someday you throw it away. To give you an example of the futility of much of military spending, and we spend now more than most of the rest of the world combined. The United States is going to build nearly, have over 15,000 tanks called an M60. They call it the main battle tank. Some countries still use it, but this you start building late 50s all the way through the 80s. The M60 tank. What do you do with these 15,000 tanks? They literally stacked over 10,000 of them under the water in one of the channels of the Mississippi Delta. They stacked tanks on top of each other to give a clear channel for ships going in and out of the Mississippi Delta on the way to New Orleans. We're talking thousands of tanks. You can dive and dive around tanks. They stacked them up in big long lines. Now each of these tanks costs nearly $1 million, over $1 million in today's dollars. So that's literally, we're talking literally billions, or hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that are stacked underground. I didn't want to talk about the environmental issue. So last look at Brezhnev. So it appeared like the Cold War was reducing, and Nixon did something else. The United States had never formally recognized the People's Republic of China. Remember, the U.S. went to war with China, but Nixon actually went to China. He went to China, and part of this was organized by his kind of diabolical national security advisor, eventually Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger organized this. This is Kissinger on the left meeting with Mao Zedong. And this is Nixon a couple years later. Mao gained a lot of weight in that period. He got sick. And funny thing about it is, it was a big deal a couple years earlier. Nixon went in 72 to Beijing, which is a big deal. The U.S. sent their ping pong team to China a couple years or a year and a half before that. And this was a big deal. We hadn't had any relations with China at all, and then we sent our ping pong team, and they got crushed. But they called this would be cover for Kissinger's beginning of negotiations. And so you might hear the term ping pong diplomacy. It comes from this. And I should add, how could Nixon go to China and the Soviet Union? Well, on the surface, it might make sense, but it might make sense because of Truman Doctrine. Remember Truman Doctrine thinking that the U.S. and virtually everybody still believed that everything, every communist, everything we don't like is being directed by the Kremlin. So we just assumed that Mao Zedong was being directed from there. As it would turn out, no, that's not the way it works. As it turns out, this might surprise you. Every country is unique. People have different political points of view. What happens in North Vietnam or South Vietnam may not be the same as the events that happen in Congo or New York City. China and the Soviet Union have never really liked each other. And China and Vietnam didn't like each other. It was just the enemy of my enemy becomes a friend. And in 1969 and 1971, two separate times, Chinese forces and Soviet forces fought on the Manchurian border, on the Amur River, fought. Over 10,000 casualties. China and the Soviet Union fought each other. No clear winner, it was a very awful, bloody skirmish. When people are shooting each other, that's an indication they might not be friends. And Nixon and Kissinger cleverly swooped in to take advantage of that divide. So in 72, it appears like Nixon's the peacemaker. And the election is coming up. And the Democratic Party had made radical changes in just the 4 years since 68. Because Humphrey was the nominee without ever going into a primary, this would be the election where an insurgency in the Democratic Party made primaries more important. And taking everybody surprised because it was brand new, a very anti-war Democrat by the name of George McGovern of South Dakota was elected president. He had a great reputation, a war hero, anti-war. He tried to take advantage, or he tried to be on the step into Robert Kennedy's shoes when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He didn't win the nomination. And McGovern was this much more of an idealist in many ways. And he very consciously began to separate the Democrats from the working class union roots, which, looking back politically, was a shocking mistake because at the same time, Nixon is trying to appeal those people and McGovern is trying to say, look at those hard hats, let's get away from them. The Democrats made a series of foolish mistakes. And if you know anything about the Democratic Party, the leadership of that party is making those mistakes, and they've kept doing it since. I'm trying to get my watch here now. And Republicans have made terrible mistakes. So, you know, I mean, that's the way it happens. But McGovern would get the nominee, and this is who Nixon wanted. Nixon wanted McGovern. He knew McGovern would, in its very anti-war plank, and that's why you notice the dove right here. Where's my mouse? The anti-war movement. And they had this illusion right here, which seemed very much like hippies, which they were trying to paint the anti-war movement. They thought McGovern would be too radical and would lose. And I think I wrote this down. His anti-war plank, they could allow him to paint him as some kind of hippie and flower child. This drug-addled hippie. And it's actually kind of funny. This was a war hero. You know, Nixon was a staff officer for a month in World War II. McGovern flew B-24 bombers. and was wounded in his plane, nearly shot down. He flew over 20 missions. He was a war hero, a decorated war hero, but they painted him as a flower child. And Nixon's campaign did a whole series of dirty tricks to try to make the McGovern campaign look even more like a bunch of drug-addled hippies. So, for example, they talked about the 3 A's. There was a rumor that many Democrats wanted to legalize marijuana. And so they immediately said, no, what McGovern wants to do is to make you take acid. There was also rumor that those who avoided the draft, like Sylvester Stallone, and fled the country, they would be allowed to come back and not be arrested. Amnesty. And then give in. Quit the fight. Appeasement. Remember Munich? The 3 A's. Ironically, yes, McGovern wanted to end the war, but everybody wanted to end the war. Amnesty? McGovern actually didn't believe that, but they said he did. Acid? McGovern was actually opposed to the legalization of marijuana, but it worked brilliantly. In fact, the Nixon campaign would pay off people to go to McGovern ads, and they would literally give them, and I'm not making this up, drugs and other things, so they'd be arrested saying they're at a McGovern campaign. This button right here, it says, come home and stop killing little babies. And vote for McGovern and Sergeant Shriver, which was John Kennedy's brother-in-law. The McGovern campaign didn't put this out. This was put out by Republicans. The dirty tricks group called CREEP, we'll get to in a second, under the Nixon. Because can't you see how this would infuriate people? It worked brilliantly. And McGovern turned out to be an inept campaigner, angering the most loyal Democrats. I'm not saying it was a bad person, because it doesn't mean, if you're an inept campaigner, it doesn't mean you're bad. But boy, it didn't work. But this is going to lead directly to what's called Watergate. Watergate was the biggest political scandal of this era, one of the biggest in American history. Nixon's campaign, they literally called it the campaign to re-elect the president, and everybody dubbed it CREEP. You can see it right here. The campaign to re-elect the president, CREEP. They're the ones who did all these dirty tricks. And one of the dirty tricks was to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which was at the Watergate Hotel, this really ugly hotel in Washington, D.C. along the Potomac. There's what it looks like. That was about 15 years ago. And the Democratic National Committee headquarters, actually not 15, over 20 years ago. That was a long time ago. The Democratic National Committee headquarters was in the Watergate Hotel. And their plan was to put bugs on phones of the receptionist and a few other people. The first one didn't work, so they broke in again. And many of these people were CIA operatives, including ones who were involved in the Bay of Pigs. And they were inept. They got caught. They were it was a foolish operation. These guys were inept. But so brazen, people didn't believe it. They were arrested by the police, and they had direct evidence tying the burglars to CREEP. But then Nixon did a cover-up. And yeah, they found that Nixon aides, right here in 72, they knew before the election that Nixon aides were involved in this sabotage. They were involved in this bugging. But the Nixon administration covered up. What they said was, Nixon would say that this was part of a CIA operation, the Bay of Pigs, anti-Castro, and so it got the FBI to cover it up. And so McGovern tried to make an issue about this, but it didn't work. It never took hold. This never became an issue, even though a few reporters kept it in the news. And so here they could push peace, strength, and stability. Nixon reelected. I should add, you're wondering why they bugged him. Nobody's 100% certain why. It appears as though they wanted to find dirt on Democrats. Nixon wanted not just an overwhelming victory for himself, but he wanted Republican control of the House and the Senate. Democrats had massive majorities, which remained after the election of 72. But he wanted to win a huge victory, and he wanted more dirt. And so one of the rumors is there's a very good chance some of the dirt would be prominent Democrats might come into Washington, D.C., and then they would find them call girls, prostitutes. And they're hoping to get that information. But they did all sorts of dirty tricks. You would not believe how many dirty tricks were involved in the Nixon administration. Some I'm not going to tell you. They had a name for it. Rat, something. I'll let you figure it out. All these were secret. And then, going September, going into October, the Paris peace talks. Now, the Paris peace talks had begun again in the summer of '69. Remember, they ended when Nixon scuttled it in November of '68 to win re-election, and 20,000 more Americans would die. Well, the Paris peace talks had been going, and the North Vietnamese then were playing hardball because they knew after Nixon was elected president, the U.S. is going to leave. So the longer we hold out, the better deal we get. I mean, that's the thing about these wars. One side, the United States, is going to win. The U.S. was never in this war for South Vietnam anyways. Remember, I gave you the reasons. It wasn't South Vietnam. They just happened to be the country involved. Now, actually, for a year and a half, nothing happened in the Paris peace talks because of table issues. Table issues? What kind of table will they sit at? And I am not making this up. They spent a year and a half because the United States, the U.S. wanted a rectangular table. So on one side of the table, so imagine let's go a rectangle. Here's my rectangle. You see me? On one side of the table will be the U.S. and South Vietnam. On the other side of the table, North Vietnam and Viet Cong. No, North Vietnam wanted a square table. North Vietnam, Viet Cong, South Vietnam, and the United States. All equal. Not two separate sides, four sides. Over a year and a half. Nothing happened. They couldn't have a circle because that's too much like a square. Eventually they came up with this big green table right here, which was an oval. Need I say more? But in secret, Kissinger was meeting with Lee Tu, the foreign minister of North Vietnam, in secret in an apartment in Paris. And in October of '72, the rumblings came out in September. In October, Kissinger announced that the U.S. and North Vietnam have an agreement. So the Paris peace talks were actually an illusion. In secret negotiations, the kind of thing that Wilson was infuriated with, remember the 14 points. A peace agreement was called, where the U.S. would pull everything out, not the bombers, everything out, but North Vietnam, and the fighting would end. There'd be a ceasefire, but North Vietnam would leave troops in place in South Vietnam. Remember I told you how North Vietnam was sending troops, at the United States sent troops. Now this is virtually the same agreement, slightly worse than the agreement that was on the table in October of '68 that was scuttled by Nixon. And this by all definition is an American defeat. If we leave North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam and the U.S. leaves, the North has a foothold to one day win and unify the country. That's why South Vietnam was furious. And so South Vietnam actually pulled out of the agreement. And much like what, same president, President Tu, much like what happened in 1968, pulled out just before the election. And this was a big year. Earlier in '72, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong did a massive offensive and nearly won. Nearly won. Big, heavy bombing and all kinds of supply problems stopped it. And then October '72, the U.S. is going to pull out. South Vietnam scuttled it. Well, the election took place anyways, I have to add. The election took place anyways. And we'll get to the election in just a second. But after the election, Nixon would begin the heaviest bombing of the war. American heavy B-52 bombers began a massive operation to carpet bomb Hanoi. I mean, kill. Well, North Vietnam was ready. They'd been bombed for a long time, up to '68. And so they had all kinds of shelters and pulled civilians out, but killed tens of thousands of civilians. didn't work very well for the U.S. They lost a large number of bombers, and actually the U.S. Air Force crewmen mutinied. They mutinied, said, we're not going to do it anymore. The bombing didn't work the way the United States wanted. And the U.S. and South Vietnam limped back to the peace table after the election in January 73 and announced a peace agreement, January 73. And it was very much an illusion. 1975, the South Vietnam would lose. And I'm going to get back to this in just one second. We'll come back to this, but the peace agreement in 73, the election would take place. I should add one more thing. North Vietnamese troops were allowed to stay in the place. Americans who were being held in North Vietnam, American POWs, would be allowed back to the United States. The most famous one was Senator John McCain, who just passed away a couple years ago. Many of them were tortured. The POWs became a big pro-war meme that North Vietnam was holding these POWs. There's all kinds of stories about the mistreatment of them, and they were horribly mistreated. But a lot of the stories were actually what the South was doing to North Vietnamese POWs. And they were released. This was the United States pulled out. But the dropping of the peace talk didn't work. Nixon would win an overwhelming victory. Not the popular vote victory that Johnson won in 64, but pretty darn close. Almost 61% and a massive electoral victory. McGovern even lost his home state. That's back when Montana had 4 electoral votes. Isn't it amazing how a liberal Democrat, LBJ, could win in 64 with one of the biggest victories ever, and then a conservative Republican 8 years later would win a victory like that? That's how much the Vietnam War had changed. And that's how much the backlash was. Now, Democrats maintained huge controls in the House and the Senate. The legacy of FDR continued. But this is the beginning of a Republican shift. And Nixon came in triumphant. But then Watergate blew up. And the reason it blew up were that Congress did begin hearings about this because some new information had come out. And then it was leaked that Nixon had been recording with a taping system all of his Oval Office conversations. And Nixon, who a lot of people said, why didn't he destroy the tapes? Yeah, that's a pretty good question, but once it came out, it was hard to go back then and say, well, I have to destroy them. Congress tried to subpoena them. They put a special prosecutor in that tried to subpoena them. Nixon would cover up using the justification of national security. National security, saying that he could not release them because it would affect our security. He also said something called executive privilege. This is exactly the same thing that would happen when President Trump was impeached. President Trump said he's not going to, the administration will not cooperate at all because of executive privilege. And so they didn't cooperate at all, and the Democrats and House kind of rolled over on that. So with that, eventually it would get all the way to the Supreme Court because Nixon would not release these tapes. Okay, they released a transcript of the tapes, but it wasn't full transcript. And Nixon swore so many times, which just shocked people. His language was so bad, and he was so racist in this conversation that the transcript would start saying something and then say expletive deleted, expletive deleted. And that became the big joke. People would get shirts saying like expletive deleted you and things like that. But in 1974, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. versus Nixon that Nixon must release the tapes. He must release it. That's the U.S. versus Nixon. And with that, Nixon actually seriously looked at the tapes. And in the tapes, he found there was a smoking gun. On the tapes, he explicitly orders the cover-up, the FBI and CIA to not investigate because of national security, the Bay of Pigs stuff. And that's when he realized he has no chance. And he resigned before he would have been impeached in 1974. I should add, if the tapes wouldn't have happened, he would have got away with it. If there would have been Republicans in control of the House or Senate, he would have got away with it. He would have got away with it. There's this belief that the system worked. See, we got Nixon. No. Just a couple things here and there different. If he could have held out, if he would not have been so inactive, they would have destroyed the tapes. He would have had such fools and creep. He would have gotten away with using the power of the presidency to overthrow an election and thus destroying what democracy we have. And so the system is very flawed because he would have gotten away with it. And with that, Nixon resigned. That's the letter saying he resigns, so he was not impeached. He was resigned. There have only been 3 presidents to be impeached. President Johnson, after the Civil War, President Clinton, and President Trump. And those 3 were not found guilty in the Senate. Nixon, by then, the Republicans, a lot of Republicans, they basically told him, we're not going to back you up. And he realized he would have been convicted. So only 3 presidents have been impeached. And that's going to lead to President Ford. Now, some of you might remember, and I went over this pretty quick, Ford, the new president, would pardon Nixon. Now, some of you might be thinking, now wait a second. Was Ford elected vice president? And the answer is no. No. Ford was not elected vice president. Ford was appointed. Nixon's vice president was the former governor of Maryland by the name of Spiro Agnew. And Agnew had to resign, and he was the bomb thrower. He attacked the media, the anti-war protesters, said they're traitors. He's a little bit like what Nixon was for Eisenhower. But Agnew had to resign in '73 because he was taking bribes as governor of Maryland, and then as vice president, he demanded he kept getting those bribes. Every day at the Blair House, where the vice president lives, or not every day, but once a month, somebody showed up with a bag full, literally a bag full of money from developers in the Baltimore area. He was taking bribes. Now, I would argue he fit in perfectly with the Nixon administration, but Ford was the Senate Minority Leader, a prominent, affable Republican who was the most fierce defender of Nixon to the bitter end, despite the evidence for Watergate. Nixon appointed him vice president after the 25th Amendment that allows for the appoint the vice president approved by the Senate. So he was never elected. He's the only president in American history who was never elected to president or vice president. And he immediately pardoned Nixon to say, finally, let's let this long nightmare go. We do not want a trial. Because Nixon, they would have had indictments of about 38 different crimes that they lumped together as Watergate, from extorting for campaign money, legal use of campaign funds, you name it. You would not believe how many things he did. I don't know if this was a quid pro quo. That's in the left-hand corner, right by my picture, is Ford making this announcement over national TV. Ford was this very affable guy. It probably wasn't, Nixon said, I'm appointing you so you pardon me, but you know, they're all part of the same crew. They're all part of the same gang. It would turn out to be, I would argue, a horrible mistake that Nixon got away with it. He should have been in jail. And that would have been a big deterrent for future presidents. But future presidents realized, hey, you have power. You can get away with things. Just get away with it. One of the best examples would be President Reagan would get away from flagrantly violating a whole series of laws called Iran-Contra. Nothing happened. Oh, President Ford is a friend of grandfather. I guess President Ford was a very nice guy. He was a lawyer. He was probably the most athletic of all American presidents. He was an all-American center at Michigan. And why they're named after Ford? Republicans. When Republicans took control of the House and the Senate, they wanted to make sure they named it after Republicans. And Ford was in the Navy. He was in the Navy in World War II. Ford was an affable guy and very athletic. And then he would be known in his presidency for being a klutz, which is just, he's by far the most athletic president in American history. He was an All-American college football player. So this would help trigger the drop in public trust, a conservative revival. And this is really sad because trust in the government. We won World War II and the Great Depression. Look at Kennedy and Johnson. And then civil rights, Vietnam, it started to fall. Collapse under Nixon and Carter. And then you could see, depending who the president, this is number 11, a little bit more trust. And public trust in government is so low. And this helps conservative economics. They said, see, look what happens when you have these regulations, when the government's out there trying to help people, etc. They just, we should have the government step out. And don't forget, what means government step out is what we have a name for it. It's called laissez-faire. And by definition, laissez-faire helps big. And so the very wealthiest people in the United States definitely pushed this distrust of government. Okay, one more thing we're going to get to. We're going to stop right there. I'm going to add one more thing right here with just very quickly the 1970s, which I'm going to finish tomorrow. Yeah! The 1970s. And the 1970s would be known as the me decade. We got to start with President Ford. And yes, this was the time of John Travolta would become famous. Part of the movie would be on disco would be called Saturday Night Fever. And there would be a big change in music, more dance music, and the growth of country music. I have very mixed feelings about the musical era at this time. So much of this protest in the 1960s for a better life, when hope was dashed after King and Kennedy's assassination, anti-war, Kent State, all that just Watergate. It became a very narcissistic age, which would help also fuel the conservative revival. And also really good clothes. So here's a big store, department store called Montgomery Ward's, which is gone now, but it was huge back then. And this is an ad for it, and I know what you're thinking. Yes, I had something very much like this. I never had a shirt like this, darn it. I knew people who had that. And this, when I was in elementary school, oh yeah. But stagflation. And stagflation with this weird economic thing, the last thing I want to talk about today, where inflation and unemployment remained high. And that should not happen. If there's high inflation, that means there's increased demand for goods. That means companies need to hire workers, and therefore unemployment should be low. Inflation was a sign of a booming economy, but that was not happening in the 1960s. It was not happening for lots of reasons. I'll get to one of the reasons in just a second. But this was unusual. Here's how high the inflation rate was in 74. Over 11% inflation rate annual. I mean, we're floating at right around 0% inflation. You in your lifetime have never seen high inflation. You would not have any idea what prices of all products going up. Now, they measured inflation a little bit flawed, but still, excuse me, I have this cough. But this became a big problem for the Nixon and then Ford administration. And they started what's called whip inflation now. And they would wear these pins. The idea is trying to get people to quit selling goods, to grow your own products. In fact, there was a big meat shortage and meat prices tripled in 1974. All these books came out about good ways to cook heart and liver. I don't want to think about it. But I love this inflation, and here's Uncle Sam literally whipping inflation, I guess. By the way, my mug's in the way, but it goes to 1980. And the Federal Reserve did what the Federal Reserve always does if there's high inflation. They raise interest rates with the idea of slowing the economy down, make it harder to borrow money to buy goods, therefore to drop inflation. But the problem is, unemployment's already high, relatively high. And therefore, that made the economy even worse. And this opened the door for conservative economics. Keynesian economics, which had brought about years of economic growth. Every country in the Western world, from Japan, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, they were all Keynesian. And now it doesn't seem to be working. And conservatives came in and said, see what happens when we have Keynesian, you have too many regulations, minimum wage, you're not allowing banks to really start investing. Take away the regulations on monopolies. Take away the regulations on banks and give the rich tax cuts and we'll get rid of this, aka conservative economics, what we have now. And I should add, the economic growth at this time, even though there was a time of stagflation, much higher than today. Why was there stagflation? It stemmed from an oil shocks. There were two massive oil shocks in the 1970s. What happened was the United States supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And we're not going to go into the details of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. But I forgot, I didn't hit that. OPEC, the oil and petroleum exporting countries, created a cartel to try to control the supply of oil, to keep prices high. Most of these countries were Middle Eastern countries. And in 73, with the U.S. support of Israel, they boycotted oil. They embargoed oil, And this is the first time that the real shock, the hidden secret about petroleum. Much of the world was reliant upon oil imports, especially from the Middle East. It was cheaper oil, U.S. oil production had dropped like a rock, and oil prices went up dramatically. In some areas, oil prices went up 400%. There'd be another one in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, 1980. And these oil shocks, all of a sudden, everything that required gasoline went up in price, aka shipping goods to market, or just simply driving your car. And they started putting gas limitations on gas stations. It would be infamous for long lines, wait to fill up as people panic and start to buy oil thinking, I might not be able to buy it tomorrow. Well, if everyone tries to buy it today because they think the price will go up tomorrow, prices go up today. And that's when the United States would mandate in 1975 to save gasoline. The United States government mandated nationwide a 55 mile per hour gas or 55 mile per hour speed limit. What the U.S. government did is they said no more money to fix your highways in states like Montana unless you go to 55. And so I remember when I learned how to drive, the speed limit was 55. And gas prices went up dramatically in this era, including, and this would dramatically help the conservative revival. Another one saying, look what happens when you have liberal economics. Let's get back to conservative economics. All these things are going to lead to the conservative revival we have today and the vast change in our society. Remember the Great Compression and the gap between rich and the poor shrinking? That is going to end. And of course, even if you want your lawnmower to be mowed, you have to be filled, you have to wait in line. So on that great picture, I am ending. So remember, I'm giving you two more examples of extra credit. If there's no more questions, yes, there's a USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know. Email me if you did the extra credit or anything. Make sure I don't miss it. And anything else, let me know. Now I am going to go. Have a great day. I'll be seeing you.